So I'm Perry Hassen, the Director of Analytics, aka the data guy. Data is on the minds of a lot of people today. As we collect more of it, there's so much we can do with it. And really what I've been tasked with at MedCan is really understanding what are the insights that we have available that we can actually use to inform decision making, and also how can that be used in measurement. So really the question on a lot of your minds is, what is the actual return on investment on some of these programs? So what I'd like to showcase to you today is a new service that we've launched called our Stewardship Report. And so really this is a thorough review of our corporate population health. So looking across all the employees that we see on an annual basis, playing back those opportunities in terms of key risk factors, again from a medical perspective. These reports are actually doctor reviewed. So we actually, in addition to the analytics team, we actually sit down with the medical team and actually draw what are some of the key insights that we're actually seeing, and what are the recommendations that come out of that. So really we're giving a full view or a transparent view of the MedCan experience and a demonstration of the value provided. So in terms of what actually goes into these reports, there's actually three key sections. Traditionally in the past through MedCan, we would provide some basic information on utilization. So how many people are coming to MedCan, what are their demographics, what are the top services that they're actually using. We'd also provide a view as to their satisfaction level. So we track net promoter scores, we get some of the verbatim feedbacks on the overall clinic experience. But what we've really done now is really a deep dive into those clinical outcomes. And so those would be things like our top risk factors, top conditions diagnosed, new and existing cancer screening, mental wellness results. We have high-risk conditions present, and again, we tie that all together with overall recommendations. So what are we actually looking for? And from a medical perspective, we want to identify risks as early as possible, as we effectively manage and reverse illness and disease. This will allow us to continuously improve the overall health of the workforce. So the top 4 conditions, and these have been mentioned a few times today: diabetes, the diabetic risk factor, often associated with overweight or obesity, high blood pressure, hypertension, lipid disorders, and high cholesterol, so some of the cardiac risk concerns, and cancer. Last year at MedCan, there were 95 what we call high-risk conditions, so pretty serious things can actually lead to mortality that we identified. And what's really interesting was the percentage of those that were actually under the age of 50 was actually 42%. It's actually quite high, so it really stresses the importance of early screening and the fact that we can manage those things when detected. It's really powerful when you actually hear those statistics. So I'm going to go through just a few examples of some of the outputs. Again, it's quite an extensive report, so I won't take you through everything, but often we start off with this one slide that just talks about perception versus reality. So when patients come for their annual health assessment, you'll actually fill out a preparation pack, which is a full series of questions that you would provide before you actually come to the appointment itself. And one of those questions is on a scale of 1 to 100, where 1 is the worst health you can imagine and 100 is the best, where do you fall? And interestingly enough, 80% of us, the majority feel like we're at an 80 out of 100. So generally people think they're actually doing pretty well. So in this case here, we would say that within one overall corporate population, 95% felt they were better than average, and only 5% felt that they were in poor health. So that's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is the doctor view. So it's the clinical assessment. And so we've actually broken them down into the 3 categories of good health in green, at risk in orange, and poor health or medical conditions in red. So in this case here, we see that of this corporate population, 20% were actually labeled as obese, and 2% actually were already diagnosed with diabetes. And within this risk factor, obviously there's a tremendous risk for future diabetes or cardiac risk. We also have a significant amount of the population, 42% are overweight, and 29% have pre-diabetes. So again, it goes back to that, well, how healthy is the population from a self-perception versus the reality of the clinical outcome. We also then start to look at a little bit deeper dive into specific risk factors. So we look at key things for diabetes and for cardiac. In this case, for diabetes, we're looking at percentage of employees that are overweight or obese, broken up by male and female. just to be a little more specific in terms of where the opportunity arises. So in this case here, we see that 85% of male executives are categorized as overweight or obese, which is a major diabetic risk factor. Thinking about what you can do with this information, maybe it's a more targeted communication or program to the male segment of the population that has an opportunity to improve. Often we'll also highlight cancer, so we'll actually indicate over the past year how many new conditions were diagnosed. So again, in this case, there were 3 new conditions, adding to an existing 23 chronic cases of cancer that we identified. We flag what we define as high-risk medical conditions, the ones that we feel have serious implications if unmanaged. And in this case here, we're looking at the number of employees with 1 high-risk condition versus those that have 2 or more. And all these charts you'll see that sometimes we'll compare the focus client on the left in the blue versus other corporate accounts as a comparison in gray. We also compare against other industry or national statistics like from Stats Canada, but this gives us a view like for like, where do we see there's some differences. So in this case here, we see that the number of comorbidities, so 2 or more high-risk conditions, is actually much higher among this client, which again just begs the question, like, how are these being managed effectively? And from a doctor perspective, we highlight the key observations that we saw, what are some of the implications if those things are unmanaged, and then ultimately what are some of the recommendations that we can put in place to mitigate some of those risks. The first example, like 85% of males carry some cardiac or diabetic risk due to being overweight or obese. The implication there is if unmanaged, serious illness or health complications can emerge, potentially resulting in short or long-term disability cases. So the recommendation would be to develop communications and programs to address a combination of nutrition, weight loss, and fitness levels. So just to end on this recap of the stewardship reports, just want to show you how different some of the results we've actually seen. In this case, we're looking at client A, client B. And again, this is actually based on some actual studies that we've completed. Client A, we saw that male employees had 2 times higher incidence of diabetic risk, and 40% of female employees had higher levels of stress and sleep difficulties. And that's actually one topic that seems to come up quite a bit is mental wellness. And again, with some of the information we're gathering, we're able to layer that on top of the other clinical information. Client B, 75% of males carried some cardiovascular risk due to being overweight or obese, and 20% of patients had at least 1 high-risk medical condition. So again, you can see just, even though it may seem subtle, there can be some pretty different recommendations that come out of the screening and the analysis based on what we're actually seeing. So I'm going to turn it over to the measurement side of things in terms of ROI, or Naomi mentioned the concept of value on investment. So overall, in terms of how healthcare has been funded, most of the things are covered by healthcare, about 70%, 30% is being privately funded. That ratio actually hasn't changed dramatically in the last 30 years, but what has changed is the percent of share that's actually coming from private funding. So we see that is actually increased by at a rate of 40%. And so why employers are realizing the returns against spending is that there are a lot of studies published that have documented the amount of payback for that investment. So for example, we see that in this study here, for every $1 spent on employee wellness, saves about $3.25 in healthcare costs and about $2.73 in absenteeism costs. Presenteeism, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, results in 3 times absenteeism costs. And lastly, health improvement results in a 10% productivity gain among sick employees, but an even better result for already healthy employees at 11%. So definitely there's a strong argument there for why the investment should be put there. To conclude, number 1, it's all about assessment. Before you can design a program to know, what things should you change, you really need to know that profile of what does your corporate population look like, and that's really the benefit of starting to look at clinical outcome data as a vital input to that overall equation. Quantification, so combining the clinical information with your own employee metrics, as well as some of the insurance claim data, so that 3-way combination can actually give us a really robust ROI and VOI opportunity number. And then lastly, action it. So developing the progressive benefit plan that are designed to really inspire your employees to be well and basically trade up. Thank you.